I still remember the sound my boots made on the back porch that morning because it was the last normal sound I heard before my entire week, maybe even my entire year, took a hard left turn. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, expecting the same view I'd looked at almost every day since buying that house 12 years earlier. And instead I found an empty patch of sky where something enormous used to be. For a second, my brain honestly refused to process it. I just stood there staring at this massive stump. Fresh sawdust spread across my yard like somebody had dumped a truckload of shredded wheat all over the grass. And the smell, if you've ever cut oak, you know that sweet smell sticks in the air. Except this wasn't firewood. This wasn't storm damage. This was my 100-year-old white oak. Gone. My name's Nathan Walker. And if you'd asked anyone in Ashford Creek what kind of neighbor I was, they'd probably tell you I kept to myself. I paid my HOA dues on time, waved at people walking their dogs, helped shovel snow for the older couple across the street, and avoided HOA meetings whenever humanly possible because they always turned into the same thing. Grown adults arguing about mailbox colors like civilization depended on it. The tree had been there long before I ever showed up. My grandfather used to bring me to this neighborhood when it wasn't much more than scattered homes and farmland. He'd slap the rough bark with the palm of his hand and say, "That tree was already old when I was your age." As a kid, I believed trees lived forever. Funny how adulthood teaches you that sometimes people are far more dangerous than nature. I walked closer and ran my fingers across the cut surface. It was still warm. Whoever did this hadn't been gone long. I noticed tire tracks leading toward the street, then fresh boot prints in the dirt. Before I could even finish putting the pieces together, my neighbor, Tom Reynolds, walked over from next door, wearing that uncomfortable expression people get when they've witnessed something they know is going to become somebody else's nightmare. He rubbed the back of his neck before saying, "Nathan, I tried calling you." I looked at him. What happened? He let out a long breath. HOA hired a tree service around 8 this morning. They said your oak was blocking the community sightline. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes your brain protects itself by refusing to believe something that stupid could actually happen. "You're kidding." He shook his head. I asked if they'd gotten permission. The woman running the crew said the HOA president approved everything personally. My smile disappeared. See, here's what made this different. About 10 years earlier, before I bought the property, the county had designated that oak as a protected heritage tree. There was even a small bronze marker bolted near the base explaining its historical significance. The previous owner made a big deal about showing it to me during closing because maintaining that tree came with responsibilities. You couldn't trim major limbs without approval. You definitely couldn't remove it. Heck, even the county had to jump through paperwork before touching it. I looked around until I spotted the little bronze plaque lying in the grass, bent but still attached to a chunk of bark they left behind. They had literally cut down a protected landmark, and somehow never bothered reading the sign attached to it. I didn't yell. I didn't march over to the HOA office. I didn't post an angry rant online. Instead, I pulled out my phone and called the County Environmental Preservation Division. The woman who answered sounded calm until I read the identification number off the landmark plaque. Then her entire tone changed. She asked me to repeat the address twice before saying, "Sir, could you stay on the property? We're dispatching inspectors immediately." 23 minutes later, 2 county SUVs rolled onto my street. That alone started drawing curtains open all over the neighborhood. People love drama, especially when government vehicles are involved. The inspectors introduced themselves, walked directly to the stump, photographed everything from every angle, measured the diameter, collected wood samples, and then one of them quietly picked up the bent bronze marker. He stared at it for several seconds before slowly exhaling through his nose. "Who authorized this removal?" he asked. Almost on cue, a white luxury SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Denise Harper, president of the Willow Ridge HOA, dressed like she was arriving for brunch instead of a crime scene. She smiled the moment she saw the inspectors because she honestly believed they were there to back her up. "Morning, gentlemen," she said confidently. "I'm Denise Harper, HOA president. I approved removing that tree. It was obstructing the appearance of the neighborhood." Neither inspector responded right away. The older one simply looked from the plaque to the stump, then back to Denise. Finally, he asked one simple question. "Mrs. Harper, were you aware this was a county-protected heritage landmark?" Her confident smile froze just long enough for me to realize she had absolutely no idea what she'd done. And for the first time that morning, I wasn't looking at the stump anymore. I was looking at the beginning of the biggest mistake that HOA would ever make. Denise opened her mouth like she was about to explain everything away with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no. Well, nobody informed the board about any landmark designation, she said with a little shrug, as though ignorance was some kind of legal defense. The older inspector looked at her for a long second before replying in the calmest voice imaginable. Ma'am, the county informed every property owner and every homeowners association in this district when these landmark registrations were completed. He paused, holding up the bent bronze plaque. Including yours. I watched something shift behind her eyes. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was confusion. She was trying to figure out whether these men actually had authority, or if she could intimidate them the way she intimidated homeowners during board meetings. Unfortunately for her, county inspectors don't care about HOA politics. They care about statutes. While one inspector continued documenting the stump, the other asked the tree company foreman to stay on site. The guy looked miserable. He couldn't have been older than 45. Sunburned neck, sawdust still covering his boots. And he already knew this job had become the worst decision of his month. Who hired your company? The inspector asked. The foreman immediately pointed toward Denise. She signed the work authorization yesterday afternoon. Denise quickly interrupted. The board approved the removal. The foreman shook his head. No, ma'am. The board never contacted us. You signed it personally. The silence after that sentence was almost loud enough to hear. I wish I could tell you Denise finally accepted responsibility. But people who spend years believing rules exist for other people rarely change in 30 seconds. She crossed her arms and looked at me instead. Nathan has complained about this neighborhood since he moved in. He's exaggerating the value of that tree because he's upset. I couldn't help smiling. Denise, I haven't said a word since you got here. Even one of the inspectors glanced sideways, trying not to laugh. That's the thing about people who constantly create conflict. Eventually, they become so accustomed to arguing that they start fighting battles nobody else is participating in. The inspectors finished their initial report, then informed everyone that the site was now part of an active environmental investigation. Nobody was to disturb the stump. Nobody was to remove debris. Nobody was to attempt replanting. Denise looked offended. It's just a tree. The younger inspector finally responded with enough edge in his voice to cut through her confidence. No, ma'am. It's evidence. That one word changed everything. Within 48 hours, my quiet little neighborhood had become the most talked about subdivision in the county. Survey crews appeared. Environmental specialists examined root systems. An arborist spent nearly 3 hours studying growth rings from sections of the trunk that the tree company hadn't hauled away yet. I learned more about oak trees that week than I ever expected to know. The arborist estimated the tree had actually been closer to 130 years old. It had survived lightning strikes, droughts, tornado seasons, ice storms, and generations of changing landscapes, only to be taken down in less than 4 hours because somebody thought it blocked the view from the entrance sign. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been sitting in my front yard. Meanwhile, Denise was working overtime trying to control the narrative. She emailed every homeowner claiming the county investigation was simply a routine misunderstanding. Then she suggested that certain residents were attempting to exploit the situation for financial gain. She never mentioned my name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. My phone started buzzing nonstop. Some neighbors apologized. Others admitted they'd questioned Denise's decision, but were told she had already verified everything with the county. One elderly woman named Margaret actually brought over an old photo album she kept since the neighborhood was first developed. There, tucked between faded birthday pictures and 4th of July barbecues, was a photograph of my oak tree from 1978. Kids were climbing the lower branches while adults stood underneath eating hamburgers. On the back, someone had written, "Community picnic under the old white oak." I sat at my kitchen table staring at that picture for almost 10 minutes. It reminded me that this tree had never really belonged only to me. It had belonged to everyone's memories, even if the legal responsibility happened to fall on my property. 2 days later, my attorney, Ethan Brooks, arrived carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Ethan wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who slammed fists on tables or threatened people every other sentence. He read documents carefully, asked short questions, and had the unsettling habit of smiling whenever opposing parties underestimated him. He spread several papers across my dining room table. "Nathan, here's where this becomes interesting." I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting good or interesting expensive?" He chuckled. "Interesting catastrophic. For them. He explained that protected heritage trees weren't valued like ordinary landscaping. Courts considered historical significance, ecological contribution, replacement impossibility, and long-term environmental loss. There's no such thing as buying another 130-year-old tree, he said. The law recognizes that. He then showed me prior cases from neighboring counties where illegal removal of protected trees resulted in six-figure settlements before environmental penalties were even calculated. I leaned back in my chair. You're telling me Denise thought she was saving money on landscaping? Ethan nodded slowly. And she may have exposed the HOA to more liability than their reserve fund can cover. That sentence stayed with me. More liability than their reserve fund. Because I happen to know something Denise apparently didn't. During the last annual meeting I'd skipped, homeowners had received financial statements showing the HOA reserve account sitting at just over $200,000. Sounds like plenty, until you realize road repairs, drainage systems, emergency maintenance, insurance deductibles, and infrastructure all depend on that money. Blow through it, and every homeowner starts receiving special assessments, which meant Denise hadn't just endangered the association. She potentially handed every family in the neighborhood a very expensive bill. News spread faster than wildfire after somebody leaked the inspection report online. Local reporters started calling. The county refused detailed comments because the investigation remained active, but simply confirming that an active enforcement case existed was enough. By Friday afternoon, television vans were parked outside the subdivision entrance. Denise absolutely hated cameras when she couldn't control them. She tried organizing an emergency HOA meeting that evening. The clubhouse overflowed with angry homeowners. I almost didn't attend. Ethan suggested I stay home. Let them eat each other alive, he joked. But curiosity got the better of me. I sat quietly near the back, while Denise stood behind the podium insisting everything remained under control. About halfway through her speech, a homeowner named Carl interrupted. Then why did Channel 8 just call asking if our HOA illegally destroyed protected county property? Denise insisted the media was exaggerating. Another resident stood up holding printed copies of county regulations she'd downloaded herself. Were you aware this tree was protected? Denise hesitated just a fraction too long. Wrong move. You could practically hear trust evaporating across the room. Questions started flying from every direction. Did the board vote? Where's the permit? Who's paying the fines? Will our dues go up? Can homeowners sue the association? Denise tried pounding the gavel, demanding order. But panic doesn't follow parliamentary procedure. People were no longer arguing about landscaping. They were arguing about mortgages, retirement savings, and property values. Then someone asked the question that truly broke the room. Did anyone besides Denise actually authorize cutting that tree? Every board member looked at each other, then slowly shook their heads. One by one. No. The entire clubhouse fell silent. Denise had acted alone. Every ounce of responsibility settled directly onto her shoulders. And for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. She glanced toward me sitting quietly in the back, hoping maybe I'd say something, maybe offer some compromise, maybe calm the crowd. Instead, I simply met her eyes and remembered something my grandfather used to tell me whenever I got angry as a kid. Son, time has a funny way of making truth catch up with people. As homeowners surrounded the board demanding answers, my phone buzzed with a new email from Ethan. The subject line read only 6 words. County penalty assessment has been released. I opened it, and the number staring back at me made even me stop breathing for a second. The first number on Ethan's email wasn't even the final number. It was only the county's preliminary civil assessment, and it was already high enough to make me read it twice just to convince myself I hadn't misplaced a decimal. The environmental penalties, mandatory restoration costs, expert evaluations, and administrative fees alone were projected to exceed anything the HOA had budgeted in years. Then came the line that really mattered. The county had determined that because the tree was impossible to replace with one of equivalent age and historical value, additional damages would be determined through a separate legal process. In plain English, the deal was still growing. I looked up from my phone just as Denise noticed the color drain from my face. For one hopeful second, I think she imagined the email contained good news. It didn't. Ethan called before I even left the clubhouse. Nathan, he said, don't discuss numbers with anyone tonight. Let the county finish what they're doing. I laughed quietly. I wasn't planning on saying much. Good, he replied. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. He wasn't wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation wrapped up piece by piece. and every new report painted an even worse picture for the HOA. The county confirmed the landmark designation had been properly recorded years earlier. Certified notices had been mailed. Digital records were publicly available. Even better, investigators recovered the email chain between Denise and the tree service. One message stood out more than all the others. The contractor had actually asked whether any permits were required because of the tree's unusual size. Denise answered, "No permits needed. The HOA has full authority." That single sentence destroyed the last defense she had. The tree company immediately cooperated with investigators and accepted responsibility for failing to verify the landmark status. But because they had relied on written instructions from the property manager and HOA president, the majority of the liability flowed right back where it started. Homeowners were furious. At the next emergency meeting, there wasn't a single conversation about flower beds, parking rules, or mailbox paint. The only topic was accountability. One family announced they were putting their house on the market because they couldn't risk future special assessments. Another retired couple demanded every board member resign immediately. Denise tried one last time to explain herself. She stood in front of nearly 100 neighbors and quietly said, "I honestly believed I was improving the neighborhood." Nobody yelled back. Somehow that made the moment even heavier. An older veteran sitting in the front row simply answered, "Intentions don't bring back 130 years. Within minutes, the board voted to remove Denise as president. 2 other directors resigned the same evening, admitting they had trusted her decisions without asking enough questions. A temporary board took over, hired outside legal counsel, and immediately opened negotiations with the county and every insurance carrier they could think of. My own case eventually settled without ever reaching a courtroom. People always ask whether I became rich because of what happened. The honest answer is, no amount of money makes you forget walking outside and finding a lifetime of history reduced to a stump. The settlement helped restore the property, funded long-term environmental projects, and established a preservation program for several other historic trees throughout the county. In a strange way, that old oak ended up protecting more trees after it was gone than it ever could have while it was standing. Months later, I planted a young white oak near the original location. It'll never shade me the way the old one did. I probably won't live long enough to see it reach even half that size. But maybe some kid walking past 50 or 60 years from now will ask why that tree matters. And somebody will tell the story about the neighborhood that learned the hard way that history isn't an obstacle to be removed just because it doesn't fit someone's idea of perfect curb appeal. Every now and then I still catch myself looking toward that empty patch of sky out of pure habit. Then I look at the little sapling beside the old stump, and I remember something my grandfather told me when I was young. You don't inherit the land from the people before you. You borrow it from the people after you. Back then, I thought he was talking about trees. Now I realize he was talking about responsibility. And honestly, I still wonder what would have happened if I had reacted differently that first morning. What if I'd marched into the HOA office screaming instead of calling the county? What if I'd let anger make the first move instead of facts? Maybe Denise would have found a way to spin the story. Maybe evidence would have disappeared. Maybe nobody would have ever known what that tree truly meant. Instead, I let the truth do the heavy lifting. And sometimes that's the strongest response you can make. So now I want to ask you, if you were in my position, would you have accepted an apology and moved on? Or would you have pursued every legal option available after someone destroyed something that could never be replaced? Was Denise simply careless? Or should leaders be held fully responsible when their decisions cost an entire community? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who believes power should always come with accountability. I'll see you in the next story.